Greetings and welcome back to the show, World War II Books Where to Start. I'm your host, Edward Layton, camped out at Station Hypo, and when I can get away from my day job of Fleet Intelligence Officer, I like to unwind by analyzing some of the battles we fought out here in the Pacific. And today I'll be looking at Midway, which you might say was my finest hour. Midway was the end of the running and the start of the winning, and despite the decades of journalistic hype about its decisiveness, it's imperative I point out from the get-go that no one surrendered and called it a day after this battle. So, by definition, if a war continues for another 3 years after a battle has been named decisive, it was probably not that. It was an attritional battle and an undeniable victory for the United States, but it no more caused Japan to sue for terms of peace than the Doolittle raid had done. This little rant will not stop or inhibit the endless parroting of this decisive battle mythology, but I wanted to get my feelings on the matter out there right away. I've got just a few of the big hitters book-wise to discuss today, along with a couple of films. There are more entries in the Midway saga that I will mention in brief as we go, and quite honestly, the last two major entries in the Midway historiography have sealed the lid for me on the battle, although I understand there's a relative newcomer to Pacific War battle histories on Mark Still. He's making kind of a stir amongst newer generations reading of the Pacific's battles for the first time. I'm kind of struggling with his Midway book on the side at the moment, trying to figure out what he brings to the table that's different and noteworthy, but that's a story for another day. And with that preamble concluded, I'll put down my code tables for the moment as we dive into those fateful days of June 1942, and let's hit the books. Battle of Midway by Mitsuo Fuchida and Masataki Okumiya. I'm butchering that name. From 55, it's 212 pages. It's subtitled The Battle that Doomed Japan. The value here is that it's a first-hand recounting of the battle from an observer, not a participant. Fuchida came down with appendicitis during the run out from Japan to Midway, and thus was not on flight duty. Despite his weakened condition, if you can believe him, and that's a key point with Fuchida on just about everything, he wandered between the bridge and his cabin on Akagi on the morning of the 4th a few times. At one point, he became dizzy and giddy as he recounts it and just flopped down on the deck of wherever he was, and someone kindly threw a parachute behind his head to give him a bit of comfort. It's also interesting to note that he switches between metric and imperial systems a couple of times. And I kind of wonder if that was just a translation/editorial thing. Fuchida's direct observations and knowledge of the Midway operation are extremely limited and would hardly merit a magazine article in length. So this book is padded out to an extreme degree with background material and a section on the Aleutians operation, plus what Yamamoto was doing with his battleship group hundreds of miles to the west, and post-battle evaluations. So what he really saw and heard is confined for the most part to Chapter 9. That's it. Granted, it's dramatic, the chapter, the heart of it all, from pre-dawn on June 4th to the disastrous 5 minutes from 10:20 to 10:25. And most of what he states about Hiryu and the torpedo pilot Tominaga and Hiryu's air group, he would have had to have heard about later. He couldn't have had direct knowledge of that stuff that day. His stats are off quite a bit too, as is his recollection at times. He thinks the Midway strike was sighted returning to Keto Batai at 0830, when in fact it was about 0805. He states that the Midway sortie lost only a total of 6 aircraft from the morning mission to put Sand and Eastern Islands aircraft groups out of operation, when in fact they lost a total of 11, and another 14 badly shot up. Further, 29 hit to some degree, and that's out of a total strike of 107 aircraft. That's nearly half the morning strike hit or destroyed from anti-aircraft defenses the attackers had not anticipated being so strong, and Hiryu's group got the worst of it. He's pretty glib about how fast the carriers can recover their aircraft, and he thinks that is child's play. I guess he's talking up his boys and patting himself on the back here, as he was part of Akagi's air group, but it's kind of senseless bragging. Then there's the infamous statement about Nagumo's carriers at last about to turn into the wind to launch their strike against the American carriers with decks full of fully armed and fueled aircraft, only to be destroyed at that precise moment by dauntlesses screaming down out of the blue sky. This bit went unchallenged for decades, until two authors I will mention in a bit blew the whole story to smithereens. So, while it's brief and readable, it's as full of holes as Swiss cheese, as they used to say in the old days. Why he felt the need for such distortions and outright lies is impossible to say without more information. His son apparently discovered a manuscript after his death that has been published as his memoirs under the title For That One Day. but I have little to no desire to pursue it because the blurb for it is obsessed by the conversion story and the Billy Graham stuff, which is human interest material and a religious tract, but it's not history. For whatever reason, his post-war religious activities have been to the forefront of the writing on the man rather than what he did in the war. To my mind, his Midway book is only a curiosity of the war, not a vital contribution to what we know about the battle. That's Midway, The Battle That Doomed Japan by Fuchida and Ukumaya. A Dawn Like Thunder by Robert Mrazek from 2008, 451 pages, main body. This takes up the tale of Midway from a particular viewpoint, that of Torpedo 8 of John Waldron fame, and explains what those 6 Avengers were doing on Midway, the Torpedo 8 detachment, what they were doing on Midway all by their lonesome amongst Marine and Army airmen as they prepared to fight the Japanese in June of 42. The first batch of Grumman Avengers had been delivered to Torpedo 8 just as the squadron had been ordered aboard Hornet for transfer to the Pacific. So half the squadron was left behind to transition to the Avenger, and then they would be carted by cargo ship to Pearl to catch up. Arriving a day after Hornet had sailed to engage the Japanese, Admiral Lee Noyes himself ordered 6 of the Avengers to Midway to bolster the defense. Why 6 is just not stated instead of the whole kit and caboodle, we don't know. It's about 1,300 miles Midway from Hawaii, so their bombays had to be taken up with extra fuel tanks. And with these 6 men and crews left behind was a detested commander, a certain Harold Swede Larson, who enjoyed being an SOB and commanded by intimidation and humiliation. Son of a congressman, unloved by everyone who had the misfortune to serve under him. He did know his business in aircraft and was no slouch as a pilot. So there was an intense desire to be among those 6 crews to be selected for the Midway job. Larson was held back by Noyes, so it was the second command of the detachment, Feverling, and 5 others who were sent. Mrazek has an easygoing writing style that draws you right into the story, and he takes the men one by one to give their backgrounds and their stories, which helps you keep everyone clear in your mind. Their part in the Midway's airstrike against the Japanese carriers has always been dealt with in a cursory fashion, sacrificial in nature due to the wide disparities in aircraft types and speeds and capabilities from several different units and across 3 different branches of the service. Any hope for cohesion was abandoned before they took off, and due to the seat-of-pants scramble to get away in the early morning, they arrived at the enemy task force in dribs and drabs and bored into the attack in widely separated packages that had little to no hope of success. 4 of the 6 Avengers were shot down. The 5th was badly beaten up and written off when it returned. But as for the rest of Torpedo 8 aboard Hornet, that day was just as disastrous as is well known. It's the best known story from the battle, John Waldron's sacrifice of his entire squadron to try to get at least one hit on an enemy carrier. With his final run in and with his devastator set ablaze, he is witnessed trying to climb out of his cockpit to bail out, but too late. George Gay is left as the sole survivor of this attack in the water, hoping not to be sighted by enemy fighters or picked up by the Japanese either. But as to why Waldron and his squadron was there alone, Mrazek breaks the story of Stanhope Ring's hopeless leadership that day. Commander of Air Group 8, he was not the type to instill hope in Americans about their fighting forces. He had badly banged up his aircraft making the very first landing aboard Hornet when she was commissioned, and was not thought well of by his men. Hornet was making its combat debut, and nothing went well for that air group that day. Slow to assemble for the strike, and they navigated to where it was thought or supposed the Quito battalion would be, but found nothing. Already stretched out on fuel, Ring's dive bombers eventually straggle out to Midway. The fighters, however, get separated, and many, to most, or perhaps all, are lost at sea, and thus the story becomes the flight to nowhere, a disgraceful episode in American military history. Only Waldron feels he knows which is the right way, and he does find the enemy task force. Mrazek is absolutely fantastic in following the men in the squadron and those left behind at Pearl as they reunite first on Saratoga and then back to Hornet, where the atmosphere is not upbeat and there's no love for Stanhope Ring. Swede Larson gets command of Torpedo 8 to make it even worse. The book then follows on to the Guadalcanal campaign and the seemingly endless combat there. When the Hornet is sunk, Torpedo 8 becomes part of the Cactus Air Force, and Larson is still there, the worst and most emotionally erratic commander to serve under. I feel perhaps it goes on a bit too long at this point, but don't skip over the appendix, where the discovery of the flight to nowhere is examined and how it would change the scholarship of the Battle of Midway and Hornet's role in it. 5 stars and not to be missed. That's A Dawn Like Thunder by Robert Mrazek. And Miracle Midway by Gordon Prange from 1982, 397 pages, main body. Portions of this book had been published in Reader's Digest, but the full book was put out following Prange's death, stitched together by his faithful research assistants Catherine Dillon and Donald Goldstein. It does not possess the depth and thoroughness of At Dawn We Slept, however, and there are a couple instances where you can see the two collaborators had great difficulty in piecing portions of the story together, or at all, so it's a bit jarring here and there. The chapters are shorter and less developed, and there's quite a bit of hopping around, switching viewpoints from American to Japanese abruptly and back and forth and intertwined across different kind of threads of the stories. It can really be quite jarring and blur the picture significantly. As a first book on Midway, I could say it's a fine intro despite its now outdated appreciations of the battle, such as the Hornet Air Group, fiasco noted above, but I wouldn't make it my only book on the battle, is all I'm saying. Fading from 3 stars to 2, that's Miracle Midway by Gordon Prange. And now on to The Battle of Midway by Craig Symonds from 2011, 366 pages, main body. So Craig Symonds, migrating from Civil War writing to the Second World War, takes up the challenge of Midway from a campaign perspective, starting with the single carrier raids of the early months of the war to the Doolittle raid to Coral Sea, and culminating at Midway. Pretty smart way to get at it, really, seeing as it's interconnected rather than isolated. Several of the top commanders are there all the way through. Think Fletcher, Spruance, Halsey, Naguma, Ara, and Yamaguchi, and many of the pilots and crews fight all the way through to Midway and some beyond. Thatch, Gray, Bess, Fuchida, Agusa, Fuchida. And of course, the famous ships of the early war are fighting and dying in these first 6 months of the war. So it's all connected. Stitching it all together is a great idea, but in less than 400 pages, there's little time to get into the itty-bitty details. But I think he gives each segment enough space to breathe and develop, and even takes a step aside to consider the code-breaking issue as a separate chapter. And that introduces a stick in the mud in the code-breaking situation, John Redmond. Not a career crypto analyst, but thrown into that position, displacing Lawrence Safford of East Wind Rain fame. Redmond doesn't like Rochefort and his direct access to Nimitz. In addition, despite not having any expertise in the field, he didn't trust his decoding efforts and estimates of Japanese intentions. Redmond had access to Ernest King, and so you can see where this is headed, but for the time being, King didn't jump to conclusions. He directed Rochefort to defend his analysis and was satisfied for the time. It must be noted that King didn't trust Nimitz either and kept him on as short a leash as possible, oftentimes yanking him out of Pearl for face-to-face meetings in San Francisco. Rochefort was correct about Midway, but his reward was to be put in charge of a floating dry dock on the West Coast and denied any credit for his part in the Midway victory. Such were the jealousies of insecure men. Regarding Midway itself, here Symonds slows down the pace and breaks it up into the time periods the way some authors do for Jutland, and chapters on Nagumo's dilemma, the flight to nowhere, the torpedo squadron attacks, the dive bombers, and the Japanese response in the form of Hiryu's two strikes were just good enough to cripple Yorktown while leaving Enterprise and Hornet untouched and unnoticed. It's smooth and clean and well delivered, like a well-aged scotch. 5 stars, that's The Battle of Midway by Craig Symonds. All right then the big boy here, Shattered Sword by Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully from 2005, 443 pages. Personally, I don't think there will ever be a more complete or a better representation of the Battle of Midway than what these two men have put together. What do they add, you ask? The technical details and the explorations of what was considered bedrock knowledge, accepted and unalterable lore, and re-examinations of events not noticed as noteworthy, such as the infamous No. 4 search plane from Tone. As they note in their introduction, the simple correlation for them, an aha moment, about the decks of the Japanese carriers during the dive bomber attacks between 1020 and 1025, the picture of those flight decks were not in fact filled to overflowing with strike planes revved up and ready to launch, as was the commonly accepted description of the crucial moments of battle. And that led them to ask some questions about Fuchida, who was the author of that kind of snapshot description in time. To their amazement, Japanese researchers told them Fuchida could not be trusted to tell the truth about a great many things and had been discredited in Japanese scholarly circles for some time. And thus was launched the greatest single book on the Second World War Second World War battle written to my date. My award, naturally, I'm going to call it the Distinguished Rivet Counter Medal. No. Don't give me that look. Don't do it. This is not a nautical version of John Erickson or David Glantz. I promise. Far from it. This is the Mount Everest of naval historiography. And in some selected moments, they even managed a bit of tongue-in-cheek humor, such as the start of Chapter 12, which chronicles that crucial 5 minutes from 10:20 to 10:25. They effectively hit the pause button and get in a couple good zingers, one-liners that may feel a bit out of place in a tale of what is really some grim business, but I found it priceless. Here is where they really tear Fuchida's story to shreds and quote a long passage from that infamous Chapter 9 I mentioned earlier and all the things that are wrong with it. It's glorious. They must, in doing so, disparage some earlier writers of Midway who have relied to a great degree of Fuchida's recounting, and to offset this, they kind of tiptoe around it as best they can in the introduction, so as not to seem like they're just hating on the guys. And I mean by these two, though, Walter Lord and Gordon Prange in particular. But it's a necessary crushing of a myth that has plagued recountings of Midway for all of eternity, or at least the last 80 years. What was on the decks of all 4 carriers were cap fighters, a few of them per carrier, as the carriers have been busy landing and launching fighters continuously since recovering the morning strike mission, which was completed about 900 hours, at least for Akagi. Thereafter, its flight logs report only cap launches and recoveries, and so do the other carrier flight logs, and it's further bolstered by the fact that Hiryu, untouched in this dive bomber assault and separated from the other carriers, did not launch her counterstrike until 10:50 hours. It wrecks Fuchida's entire story. As well, this new look at the famous 5 minutes also throws into relief the sacrifice of the torpedo squadrons, which under the older scholarship had all concluded their attacks and withdrawn from the scene before Maxwell Leslie, Wade McCloskey, and Dick Best reached their tip-over points. In fact, VT-3, Ken Massey's unit, was just going into his attack against Hiryu at this point, where he would lose 10 of his 12 aircraft. Backing up to the matter of that search plate from Tone, Partial and Tully rethink the matter entirely and its search arc and conclude, far from being late to the party, that late launch actually allowed it to spot the Yorktown group. Had it launched as intended, it would never have spotted that carrier. There's far more, of course, from how the IJN operated the aircraft, with their characteristic twin-stacked hangars and the tricky elevators this demanded, to the awkwardness of using aircraft that only hardly fit on those elevators and whose wings only folded at the tips in the case of the zeros and fouls, to the complete lack of give a damn when it came to AA defense, where the carriers were essentially each on their own and with an inadequate, to say at least, battery of guns to fend off attackers. Stanhope Ring is not ignored, nor is the pasting given to Mikuma, and a lot of space is given over to the efforts of both to fight the Infernos on the Japanese carriers and their rescue efforts. Careful attention is paid to the idea of America being the underdog and outnumbered, hence the miracle aspect of the victory. Partial and Tully correct this, adding up the raw numbers, including those aircraft at Midway itself, gave the Americans an advantage, if only on paper. As it turned out, Hornet only managed 15 planes on target that day, so in real effect, I would argue it was really 4 carriers to 2, plus a smidgen of a third. Aircraft that never really engage are hardly countable, right? Had, say, Hiryu managed to stay intact and the engagement somehow lasted the second day, Hornet's remaining dive bombers may have counted as important assets against Kido Butai. There is a lengthy dissection of the whys and wherefores after the killing stops. It's fantastic as well. I think they address every single issue of the battle, leaving no stone unturned, even down to the rumor that Hiryu might have sported a crew radar set that day. All in all, it's a 6-star outing, and I sincerely wish this hadn't been a one-off collaboration by this pairing of Partial and Tully. I was hoping they would team up for a stab at Pearl Harbor, or perhaps one of the carrier engagements at Guadalcanal, but it doesn't seem like they had any interest in continuing that partnership. You can find plenty of Partial on YouTube discussing the book. He must be sick of it by now, but he does a lot of lecturing on the battle. Tully has put out some other books, but nothing reaching the peak achieved here. It may be too much for some folks, and many will be content with the Symonds or the Mrazek book. I think it sets the bar for evermore. That's Shattered Sword by Partial and Tully. Well, that wraps up a gargantuan effort at dissecting the Battle of Midway from a literary perspective. There are 2 films, of course, Midway 76 and Midway 19. They have their defenders and their detractors. I'm not in love with either one. But overall, I think the actors in the 2019 effort didn't quite get it, and the CGI is, well, it's It's CGI, while the Charlton Heston version suffers from Charlton Heston. But Henry Fonda is awesome in the 76 version. By now, my faithful viewers, you may be wondering, how can you read so many books about this one fight that lasted, for all intents and purposes, in its primary actions, from pre-dawn to about 1700 on one day? Well, it's the one that fascinates me the most of the 4 carrier battles in 42, and I could talk about it with folks for hours. I really could, and perhaps I have. It's not that I have OCD about Midway. I don't. It's just that I'm dedicated. There's plenty more to say about Midway, but not here and not now. I was asked by a viewer a while back to do a video about the books on Midway that are bad to awful, and I've kept that in mind, and now that I've run across several of those efforts, I can see the way forward and will report on the ugly downside of Midway scholarship someday in the future. But for today, I hope one or more of these has tickled your fancy about the end of Yamamoto's hopes and dreams for a Pacific War victory. I'm Edward Layton, hanging out on my lanai here on Oahu, working on the next big thing and dreaming of the day I can punch Richmond Kelly Turner in the face. Until next time, happy reading.